And now I'm joined by UK Catholic journalist Caroline Farrow, a great commentator. She has a wonderful ability to be hot-headed or cool-headed as the situation dictates, and I really admire that. Thank you, first of all, very much for joining us, Caroline.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking a little bit this week about the papal exhortation, which is called Everything is Awesome, Everything is Cool When You're Part of the Team, only in Latin. First of all, what is the exhortation in terms of its weight as a teaching document?
Okay, so as a teaching document, it carries maybe slightly more weight than your local priest's homily. So, we should always pay attention to what the Pope has to say and say,
yes,
he's trying to teach us. It is part of the magisterium, but it isn't actual doctrine. So we can read it, we can take note, we can say, okay, Pope Francis, Your Holiness, this is what you're saying to us, but we don't necessarily have to abide by the letter of it. And it's not teaching us, it's not infallible. It's not an ex cathedra statement. It's just, the Pope tried to teach us something.
You could almost say that it's like a homily in newsletter form from the Pope.
Yeah, almost.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's one step down from a papal encyclical and one step up from, like a homily. So by sort of criticising it or analysing it, you're not doing anything heretical. You're not challenging the Pope's teaching authority. You're saying, okay, this is my impression of the document. This is what I think of it. And so do that in good charity, then that's fine.
Right. Well, and also some people of a certain political bent have loved the document, particularly 2 lines in it, and they've made heavy use of it, as I've already mentioned. And you wrote eloquently on that topic. And I think that's almost more urgently to be addressed than the exhortation itself, which, of course, we can all, as you recommend, quietly read, personally reflect on our own lives and how it applies to us in our own call to holiness. But what about the reaction and the general use of the document so far?
Well, I think what's concerning about it is, predictably, the liberal press or the left-leaning press, so the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, various kind of left-leaning publications have taken one line in it which says that basically all lives are equal, that the life of the migrant has equal validity to the life of the unborn. Now, and everyone has taken that and interpreted that as campaigning for migrants and campaigning for refugees is as important as campaigning for the unborn. And there's this kind of implication that actually Catholics need to stop campaigning for the unborn.
Right.
There's one thing that the Pope says, and it does really concern me. He puts scare quotes around the use of grave bioethical issues, scare quotes around the word grave. Now that bothers me because that kind of minimises the seriousness of bioethical issues, which, have implications, the deepest implications for humanity. The idea that we can create life in a laboratory, we can search for this non-existent perfection. What implications or consequences is this going to have down the line in generations' time for humanity? In the UK, we've got things like 3-parent embryos, we're pushing for embryo experimentation.
Right.
There's all kinds of things going on. And this could really profoundly affect the future of humanity. So to kind of put grave in scare quotes, I think is a bit unhelpful. And I think while Pope Francis is right, nobody is saying that the lives of the unborn are worth more than the lives of anybody else. He talks about not prioritising the issue. And I think this is one of the challenges of Pope Francis's papacy here, because he's South American Pope, as we know, he's first Pope from South America, and he's speaking to this universal church. And he's speaking, I think, from the perspective of a South American, where most countries in South America have quite heavy regulation and legislation regarding abortion. So in Chile, for example, it is practically outlawed. But here in the UK, we have the most liberal abortion laws in Europe. So at the moment, you can abort.
And real quick, also in the U.S., we're even more liberal than you in many of our states. We are extremely lenient.
Yeah. So, this is really problematic. And in the UK, we are facing a number of pro-life challenges. So we're coming up to, in a couple of weeks' time, it's the 50th anniversary of the passing of the Abortion Act, or when it was implemented. And in that time, 8 million unborn have died. And what we're facing now is, so on Tuesday, in a London borough of Ealing, I was there, they've passed a draconian law forbidding pro-life vigils outside the abortion clinic. Now, these are vigils that really help mothers in need. They've now been banned. they're looking to completely decriminalise abortion so that you could have an abortion for any reason whatsoever right up until birth. There's also a lobby to get the medical professionals on side, the Royal College of Nursing and Midwives, and to remove conscience rights for medical professionals. So currently, if you're a doctor or a midwife and you don't want to participate, you don't have to. They're talking about removing that conscience protection. So we really need in the UK, and I think in America, but we really need people to speak up against this. And what happens in UK parishes particularly is we already have a focus on refugees, on migrants, the home,
for sure,
prisoners, mental health, all of these things. But pro-life in many, many parishes is very dependent on having either a priest who's on side or a parishioner who's pushing it. And in so many parishes, you will see, in the newsletter, actions for the homeless and actions for the soup kitchens and all these marvellous initiatives that I'm not knocking, but nothing about crisis pregnancy centres, nothing about engaging people in political action. And, some bishops are better than others. And so we don't need any more encouragement in the UK. If you're kind of saying that you're doing something for charity and you're going off to Calais, for example, in France, to help in the refugee camp, there's a whole jungle, it was called, of potential immigrants trying to cross the channel to come into England. If you were there helping them, you've got a virtue signalling pat on the head. Helping the migrants and the homeless, helping these marginalised people carries no stigma in the UK. Get a pat on the head for your virtue. Helping the unborn is like the love that dare not speak its name. Priests don't want to upset parishioners, and you're seen as judgmental. And there's many, many kind of younger Catholics who don't agree with the Church's teaching.
Right. So the context, just to shorthand this, the context that you're living in and many of us in the U.S. are living in too, with regard to the abortion issue, is not only is abortion being pushed on young people, especially young girls in crisis pregnancy scenarios, but resisting abortion and arguing against it and being an activist against it, sidewalk counseling, and also, of course, political activism, all of those things are being marginalized. So the babies themselves, of course, are being disempowered and endangered, but even those who would defend them are being disempowered, and everyone's trying to silence them, both legally, by the way, and through social methods of ostracism. So in that context, it's very hard to swallow the pill of, what you're doing isn't that important. And also all of your people chumming around with the elites in your culture and the people closest to centers of power who are in no need of having their heads pumped up any more than they already are. Those people are actually doing just as well as you. Thank you very much. It's very hard to swallow that. And to some degree, you could read that into the papal document. I won't go too far with that, but I wouldn't blame people, for instance, who are hard workers on behalf of the unborn and who are like, this doesn't feel like it's very kind toward me, this document itself. But most importantly, I want our listeners to know, if people are using this exhortation to go after you, keep in mind what Catholic Vote President Brian Burst just pointed out. Read the document, but also read it within the context of the whole teaching of the Church and in the context of our historical surroundings. And like you said, where you are in the UK and where we are in the US, in terms of social status and what happens to you if you're a pro-lifer versus what happens to you if you're an advocate for these other causes, which are very much in vogue and will certainly not raise any eyebrows among the powerful. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would draw attention to a couple of things as well. So when I was at Ealing, where the abortion buffer zone has been introduced, a so-called safe zone, there was a black woman who was on her knees begging, with her 9-year-old son, begging these middle-aged males not to introduce this buffer zone, because she said without it, her son wouldn't exist. And there were all the women that had been helped were immigrant women, poor women, they were really on the margins, and they'd been helped to have children, and they were being booed and shouted and heckled down by a bunch of white middle-class women. I mean, it really...
It's very stark contrast. Yeah, minorities, racial minorities and refugees, ironically, are the ones most targeted with abortion.
Yeah.
Isn't that strange?
It's outrageous. And the other thing I think to remember, is that this focus on refugees and migrants is not new. So St. John Paul II in 1988 set up the Pontifical Council for Migrants and Itinerants. The idea that Catholics need to care for migrants, for refugees, for the poor, the marginalised, the dispossessed. This is not a new thing. Of course this is gospel, but there are so many other advocates for these groups. Right. Catholics seem to be the only advocates for the unborn, and we're the only people really out there giving them a voice. And I think the Pope isn't saying these other people are more important, and traditional pro-lifers aren't saying the unborn are more important, but obviously we all have finite amount of time, and it's fine to prioritize. What has happened is that, Pope Francis famously doesn't read newspapers, and he doesn't look on.
That's good, because that means he didn't read your column, Caroline.
No, and he should have done. But, I appealed to him. I said, Holy Father, we need more people speaking out on pro-life issues, not less. And I think you can very much interpret.
I have a feeling that if you sent that, I don't think it would get past the Vatican post office, but that's another topic. Sorry, go ahead.
But I think you can very much interpret this paragraph as an attack, a little sideswipe on Donald Trump, because he's talking about how politicians can prioritize the unborn, but Catholics, we Christians, we can't do that. And I think there's nothing wrong in getting pro-life, because obviously a lot of Catholics voted for Trump on the pro-life ticket, and there is nothing wrong with getting politicians to perhaps broaden their focus if that's what he wants to do. But there were slightly, I think, better, wiser, more prudent, judicious ways of phrasing that, and has given the pro-choice lobby and the Liberals a little bit of a gift, who can now say, hey, you need to stop campaigning and prioritising and making the unborn an issue because your Pope says so here. And you're just like, oh, no, thanks, Holy Father.
God help us. Yeah, I get more and more of those comments, by the way, by people who have always hated the church, and now they're saying, I'm going to tell your Pope on you. Do you know what he's been saying? You ought to listen to him. I'm like, I don't remember you saying that about Benedict. But anyway.
I know.
Well, thank you very much for your analysis, Caroline. Let's have you on the show again soon. And also, where can our viewers find your work in general?
Okay, so I write a column for the Catholic Universe, which is a UK Catholic newspaper every week. I do bits and pieces everywhere, really. I write for a site called The Conservative Woman. I've done a couple of blogs for the National Catholic Register, Mercatornet, an Australian conservative publication. Look me up on YouTube. I'm always on the television. BBC, Sky News, Good Morning Britain, Piers Morgan. I've appeared with him a number of times. If you look me up on YouTube, you can see a lot of my media appearances and work. And I've got a blog. So, just Google me. And
you've reached prominence when you just say, yeah, just Google me. That's good. But don't Google her. DuckDuckGo her, because Google is evil. All right. Thank you again, Caroline.
Thanks.
And we'll talk to you again soon. Keep us posted.
Thank you. Cheers.
Well,